So, like I said, I'm just making you do the packet pages. I'm not having you do the worksheet. Okay? So, this still contains the concepts that we've already learned. Okay? So, we've talked about that secant of x is 1 over cosine of x. Cosecant of x is 1 over sine of x. Tan of x is sine of x over cosine of x. And cotangent of x is cosine of x over sine of x. Okay? You also need to recall that sine squared of x plus cosine squared of x equals 1. That cosine squared of x equals 1 minus sine squared of x. And that sine squared of x equals 1 minus cosine squared of x. Okay? Those are all things that we have talked about so far. We have also talked about you need to change everything to versions of sine and cosine. We also talked about finding common denominators, okay, as well as those concepts that are up there. Okay, so those are the things that you need to remember about this. Now, there are 3 new things that this covers today. The first thing that we need to talk about is the difference of squares. So for example, if you have x squared minus 1, that's x plus 1 and x minus 1. How this comes in today is with the sine squared of x equaling 1 minus sine squared. Sine squared of x equals 1 minus cosine squared. Cosine squared equals 1 minus sine squared. These are differences of squares. If you have 1 minus sine squared of x, that is equal to 1 plus sine of x, 1 minus sine of x. Okay, it is a difference of squares. If you have 1 minus sine squared of x, that's equal to 1 plus sine of x and 1 minus sine of x. The same is true for the cosine version. If it's 1 minus cosine squared of x, that's equal to 1 plus cosine of x, 1 minus cosine of x. Okay? That's the difference of squares concept that it's referring to. Okay? If you have opposites, so for example, if you have negative cosine squared of x minus sine squared of x, so if they change the sign on both on this side, means the sign gets changed over there. The same is true for this one. If you have negative cosine squared of x, then you have 1 or negative 1 plus sine squared of x. If you have negative sine squared of x, that equals negative 1 plus cosine squared of x. Do you guys see how if you change the sign of one side, it can change the signs of the other side? Okay? So that's another concept you're going to use. And then the final one is conjugates. Okay? That if you see something like cosine of x plus 1 and you're stuck, try multiplying the top and the bottom by cosine of x minus 1 and see what that gets you. Okay? So a conjugate is just changing the middle sign in a set. So if you see this on the bottom, and that's where it'll be on the bottom, okay, which, did we see that over here? No, I think it was the one I just erased. But if you see this on the bottom, try multiplying by its conjugate. Okay? So we're going to see all of these in the examples that are to follow. So you're going to see what I'm talking about here in a second. Okay? So, for example, if you have secant to the 4th of x minus 1, we want to prove that it equals that very complex full right-hand side. Okay? So, your first step should always be what? Change the cosine sign. If you have secant, secant is 1 over cosine. And so what you get from this left-hand side is 1 over cosine to the 4th of x minus 1. That cosine to the 4th of x on the bottom is encouraging because isn't that what this is? Okay, so that's encouraging that we have that. So next, What do we have to multiply that minus 1 by? Cosine to the fourth of x, right? So we have to multiply this by cosine of the fourth of x over cosine to the fourth of x. So what that gets us is 1 minus cosine of the fourth of x over cosine to the fourth of x. At this point, it's telling me that my bottom is where it needs to be. Do you guys see that? My bottom is what I want it to be. Now, we just have to get the top. Okay? Now, if you have 1 minus cosine to the fourth of x, okay, and this is kind of complicated, but what it wants you to use is this idea that we have a difference of squares. Okay? Now, it's a little bit different because it's to the fourth. The difference of the squares would be 1 minus cosine squared of x times 1 plus cosine squared of x. So I'll give you a second to write that down, then I'll explain how that works.
Isn't it, like, can't we just flip the signs and then do sine squared of x?
Yeah, that's our next step. You got it. Right? We're going to change this?
Yeah.
Yep. If you want to do that, go ahead. And then you just distribute. So, does everyone have it written down? I can explain it. So if I have 1 minus cosine to the fourth of x, these are both squares. 1 squared is just 1, so that's why the 1 gets written down. What you do is you square root this. Okay? What's the square root? Well, I guess it's not really the square root of 4. But when you do that, okay, if you square root cosine to the fourth, you get cosine squared. And that's where each of these come in. Okay? It divides that exponent by 2. Okay, above we were doing the same thing with this. If I divide this exponent by 2, I get 1 of each, right? So if I had sine to the sixth, what would each of these become? Sine to the thirds. If I had sine to the eighth, becomes sine to the fourths. Okay? That's what happens when you do this difference of squares. It divides that exponent by 2. If it's a 2, it just becomes 1s. Okay? Now, the reason I knew to change it was I saw that this is much more expanded. Okay, so when I saw that was expanded, I was like, ooh, this is way too small. The only way to expand this is to make it a difference of squares. Okay? So now that I've done that, Becca just told me what my next step is. 1 minus cosine squared of x is sine squared of x. Okay, so that left-hand side becomes sine squared of x times 1 plus cosine squared of x over cosine to the fourth of x. And then your last step to get this is just to distribute this sine squared of x. So that gets you sine squared of x plus sine squared of x cosine squared of x all over cosine to the fourth of x. Yep. And then sine squared of x times cosine squared of x just sets them together. Yep. You can't combine those because they're not the same trig. All right, are we ready for the next one? Okay. So you see cotangent of x minus 1 squared. What should always your first thing be? Change it to sine and So this would be cosine over sine, correct? Okay. So this is cosine of x over sine of x minus 1. And then this is squared. Okay? Does anyone have any idea on what I should do next? Yep, multiply the 1 by sine. So you get cosine of x minus sine of x all over sine of x. That quantity squared. What do you think we should do next? We can't change the right-hand side. You're close. We have to write it twice and then distribute. Okay, so we're going to write it twice. So we have cosine of x minus sine of x over sine of x times cosine of x minus sine of x over sine of x. What should we do next? Distribute, right? We can distribute some stuff. So I'm going to distribute cosine, and then I'm going to distribute sine. Okay, so cosine times cosine is cosine squared of x minus sine of x times cosine of x minus sine of x times cosine of x plus sine squared of x. All of that over sine of x. What do you think we should do next? Combine like terms. Wouldn't this be 2 sine cosines of x's? Negative 2 sine cosine of x's? And then I'm going to reorder this just to maybe give you a little hint about what the next step is going to be. So if I have sine squared of x, and then I have a cosine squared of x, and then I have 2 sine of x cosine of x. Oh, the bottom should be sine squared, right? These are multiplied. Sorry, it just registered because I realized we were missing something. Which one? I forgot to square this because these are multiplied instead of added. If you're multiplying them, you multiply the bottoms. So then you have 2 sines. Why did I rewrite it like this? Because that equals 1, right? Sine squared plus cosine squared is 1. So couldn't this entire section become the number 1? Okay. So we are almost there. We have 1 minus 2 sine of x cosine of x over sine squared of x. There's 2 more steps. What did they do next to get cosecant squared minus 2 cotangent of x? They split it up next. Okay, so they said, not only can I put fractions together when they have common denominators, I can split them back up and put them back to common denominators. So I can write 1 over sine squared of x minus 2 sine of x cosine of x over sine squared of x. What is 1 over sine? Cosecant. And so if I have 1 over sine squared, isn't that cosecant squared? Okay, so that first fraction is cosecant squared, which is what we wanted. Now I have some weird garbage. Don't know what that is. right? Minus. In the second fraction, what happens to this sign and this squared sign? This one cancels and the squared cancels, right? Then you have cosine over sine. What's cosine over sine equal to? Cotangent. So you have 1 on top and then you have 2 on the bottom. So you cancel the one that's on top with one of those that's on the bottom. So you're still left with 1 on the bottom. Okay? Mm-hmm. All right. Are we ready for the last example? Is there 2 more? Okay. Yep. All right. So this one, before we begin, what do you notice both sides have? So do you think you're going to touch the 4 as you work through this? No. If you have it on one side and it's already appearing on the other side, don't change anything about it. So we're only going to focus on changing this to this. Does that make sense? Okay. So we're focusing on this part, changing to the negative tan squared of x. Okay? So we're just going to, I'm going to do this. I'm just going to drop this 4 down to my very end. Okay, and I'm sure I'll need it. I would put the 4 down here probably. It's probably going to take that much space. But let's start with changing our secant squared of x. So we have negative. What is secant equal to? 1 over cosine. So this is going to be 1 over cosine squared of x plus 1 is what we're dealing with. Okay, ignore the 4 because we know that it's on each side. It's going to come back anyways. Okay. So then what do we have to do to the 1? Common denominator, which is cosine squared, correct? Over cosine squared. So you have negative 1 plus cosine squared of x over cosine squared of x. What is negative 1 plus cosine squared of x equal to? Not negative sine squared. So notice that it's changed, right? It's a negative 1 and positive. Okay, and remember, if the sign changes on this side, it changes on this side as well. So negative sine squared of x is what that's equal to. So I have negative sine squared of x over cosine squared of x, which what would that be equal to? Tan. So then we have 4 minus, because this is negative, tan squared of x. Are we ready for the last one, or do you guys have any questions on this one? No? I feel like that one was the easiest one today. Okay? All right, so this one, you have 1 plus cosine of x equals over sine of x equals sine of x over 1 minus cosine of x. Okay, what did I say you're going to see today in your problems? So, conjugates. Do you guys see how this is a plus and this is a minus? So if you see that happening, you're going to multiply the top and bottom by the conjugate of the one you have to work on. Okay, so this is the one I have to work on, right? So I'm going to multiply top and bottom by the conjugate of this. So I'm going to multiply this by 1 minus cosine of x, 1 minus cosine of x. Okay, and I'm going to work from there. What do you think you have to do to the top? Distribute, multiply. Okay, so 1 times 1 is 1, minus cosine of x, plus cosine of x, minus cosine squared of x, all over sine of x, 1 minus cosine of x. Now, I knew not to distribute the bottom because you guys see how Now I have what I wanted on the bottom over here on the bottom. So when I saw that, I was like, ooh, I don't want to distribute the sign because I have what I want. Okay, I need to just get rid of this sign somehow. Does that make sense? Okay, so in the middle up here, what those two cancel, right? And you're left with 1 minus cosine squared of x. What is 1 minus cosine squared of x equal to? It's equal to sine. So your top, you get 1 minus cosine squared of x over sine of x, 1 minus cosine of x. Okay, this is equal to cosine squared. No, sine squared. So we have sine squared of x over sine of x, 1 minus cosine of x. What happens if you have two signs on top and one on bottom? Bottom cancels, one on top cancels. So you're left with one on top and your bottom, which is what you wanted to get to, right? Okay, so if you see that conjugate, and it'll always be opposite. If you see that conjugate happening, multiply the one you're working on by its conjugate. Yes?
But how do we know to do it by the conjugate if there's 4 options on the test? You know, we have A, B, C, D, and they'll all be different right sides.
What I'll probably put is like A would be cosine over this.
Good.
B would be cosine over 1 minus sine, which you could cross off right away because you see it's not the conjugate. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Like I'll make it so the conjugates are, there's some sort of conjugate to get you to recognize it.
Okay. Are you going to do that for all the different things we'll see?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think there's only 2 on the test of this.
Okay.
Okay? So not all of these concepts are going to appear on the test.
Okay.
So like cosine on that side, that means it needs to be in your answer too.
Yeah. Yep. That if you see this happening and your answers all have something like this on the bottom, hopefully that triggers conjugate is happening. Okay? So again, that worksheet got taken off. It was kind of just busy extra work. Okay? So just finish your packet today.